Okay, so we're picking up today with Asian migrations 1300 to 1750. And I just want to start by saying that the conquests of Western Europeans and those of Central Asians show remarkable similarities. For one, they occurred in the same time period. Two, both traveled vast distances and were ruthless in conquest, and both sought to impose their culture on others. And there were some differences as well. Defeated Asians didn't suffer the diseases that swept away the populations in the Americas. Asian conquerors were mostly nomadic horsemen with very little experience in sedentary lifestyle. Therefore, they were limited on their ability to impose culture. And also, Asian empires began to decline by the 18th century. And so we'll start with the Ottoman Empire. The rise of the Ottomans, it comes from a guy's name, Osman, O-S-M-A-N. And Osman was a Turk whose military success laid the foundation for the empire. And it sort of paralleled the rise of Spain and took place around 1600. So the Turks relied on Ghazis, who are just Turkish warriors, Sufis, who conducted like mystical ceremonies and traveled with the troops, almost like a priest, and Janissaries, who were slave soldiers. And these slave soldiers were forced to convert to Islam, and sometimes they were actually elevated to government positions. But the Turks relied on the Ghazis, the Sufis, and the Janissaries to carry out and to sustain their conquest. And the Ottoman Turks moved into Europe around the early 1500s and took the Balkans. And the Balkan Peninsula is like Greece, Macedonia, Bulgaria. But they only made up like a fifth of the population. Under Mehmed, this is a person, the second, he was called the Conqueror, and he was the Sultan from 1451 to 1481. And under him, the Ottomans took Constantinople, that was the capital of the Eastern Roman Empire. So this was a really big accomplishment. They also took the rest of Anatolia and Crimea. So this was basically where their power base was. Constantinople, of course, was turned into Istanbul and became the Ottoman Turk capital. Suleiman the Magnificent, and we're running out of room to write stuff here. Suleiman the Magnificent was the Sultan from 1520 to 1566, and he turned again toward Europe, and he added Hungary and even reached the gates of Vienna, Austria. They stopped their expansion in the 1700s because they attempted to take Russia. They had taken Ukraine and thought that they would just go and try to take Russia as well, but they failed because Peter the Great had built up defenses. And so the Ottoman Empire was really wealthy because most of their holdings were along the coast, and so that encompassed lots of trade cities. That's where the merchant money was. But they fell off really quickly. They grew to an empire around 1600 and then sort of fell off into decline really quickly. But the population grew from 12 to 13 million in 1520 to 60 or 70 million in 1600. So they were large in terms of population. So that brings us to India and the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire lasted from 1526 to 1707. And the Mughals were a mixture of the Mongols and the Turks, and they began their invasion of India in 1526. The Mughal Empire experienced great success under one of the early Mughal emperors, Akbar. And he ruled from 1556 to 1605, and was considered one of India's greatest rulers. And he ruled as an absolute monarch, meaning that he shared power with no one. And he had quite the genealogy. He had descended from Genghis Khan, Timur the Lame, Babur, and so there were great expectations for him already in place before he even took the throne, but he lived up to them. He was ruthless. He massacred an entire population of 30,000 people at Chittor, which was a historical fortress, in 1568. And he also conquered Gujarat and their extensive trade routes, Bengal, Kashmir, Orissa, the Sindh. He was constantly on the move with his troops and created several capitals for himself. The first at Agra, where his grandson would later build the Taj Mahal for his wife. And this empire was based on taxes, and they were able to thoroughly survey resources so that they could exploit them, pretty much. But he also set up an administrative bureaucracy, much like a military hierarchy. But he did manage to temper all of this conquest with appeasement of the Hindu population. Akbar was a foreigner and a Muslim in a predominantly Hindu country. And so he offered Hindus government and military positions. He let them keep ancestral lands. And in exchange for that, they paid him tribute and offered their daughters in marriage for political alliances, since Muslims were allowed to practice polygamy. In 1582, Akbar proclaimed the personal religion of Din-e-Ilahi that combined Hinduism, Islam, and Parsi. And this personal religion claimed divine rights, meaning the gods had bestowed him with this kingship, and they had given him favor to rule. He appointed himself mediator of all religious disputes and declared himself vice-regent of God. And he emphasized all of this supremacy with elaborate rituals. So he came up with his own personal religion so that he could control religious issues, pretty much. And he became one of the most respected emperors, especially as art and literature flourished during his time. And really, he succeeded at establishing one of the great empires of the world. Unfortunately, his great-grandson, Aurangzeb, make sure I don't spell that incorrectly, Aurangzeb, who ruled from 1658 to 1707, squandered these achievements and ended the reign of the Mughals in a weakened position by forsaking tolerance and imposing a harsh poll tax on Hindus and desecrating their shrines. So by the 1750s, the Mughal Empire laid open to invaders. So that brings us to Safavid, that's how that's pronounced, Safavid Persia. And this empire lasted from 1400 to 1700. The Mongols and the Turks first devastated and then repopulated Persia in the 13th century. And they came in, exterminated the population, settled on their land, and reduced those people to serfs, pretty much, taxing them to the point of poverty. But eventually they adopted Persian culture and Islam to help unite the people. Timur the Lame was ruler from 1336 to 1405, and we talked about him being one of the ancestors of Akbar, but he ruled Iran, Anatolia, which is like Turkey, and Syria, and extended Mongol rule from Turkey all the way through North India. The Turks came to make up about 25% of the population. And they were pastoral people, meaning they raised animals in the pastures. They were nomadic, meaning they traveled from place to place. And the areas that they conquered went from agricultural lands to pasturage. So the lands went from growing crops to having grass so that the cows and other animals could eat. Some Turks in Safavid Persia came to accept the militant teachings of Sheikh Safi al-Din, and we'll just say al-Din, it's much easier. And the followers of this guy were called Safawids, and they claimed religious and political authority. And so in 1501, one of his disciples, Shah Ismail, declared himself the hidden imam, or the long-awaiting political and religious messiah of the Shiite Muslims, and proclaimed himself the Shah of Iran. And so the Shah is just the title for the Iranian leader. And the Safawids found it really difficult to unify the people of Iran. Shah Abbas, this is a person, title Shah, name Abbas, brought in Western technology and tried really hard to hold on to power in Iran. He built muskets and artillery matching the Ottomans, brought in slaves to fill the army, built a new capital at Isfahan, encouraged trade and commerce, murdered competing religious leaders, and eventually gave sanction to convert Jews and those who practiced Zoroastrianism by force. So that brings us to China. And of course, dynasties rule in China. These are families of rulers. And so the Mongol dynasty ruled from 1271 to 1368. And Genghis Khan was the first Mongol invader in China in 1211. And he and his men pretty much destroyed the Song dynasty. And so the Mongols were finally kicked out of China in 1368 by the Ming dynasty. And the Ming dynasty rebuilt the wall of China and feared the Mongols, and rightly so. And they had a time trying to keep out the Mongols because they had kicked out their leaders with the Mongol dynasty, but the Mongols were still living to the north of the empire. And so that is why they rebuilt the wall, to prevent them from coming in. Invasions in 1644 brought the Qing dynasty to power. And these were Manchurians. And this was another group of outsiders who came into China and took over. And they held power from 1644 until 1911. And they undercut Chinese power. The population fell during the Qing dynasty because of natural disasters. They didn't set up good irrigation systems. There were epidemics that took out droves of the population. The Qing dynasty did expand the Chinese borders, though, and they almost more than doubled the country. And the population was pretty much sustained by American crops. The sweet potato, maize or corn, peanuts. Eventually, with the improved health of Chinese rural workers or farmers, it again led to a population increase. So this concludes our video on Asian migrations, and we will pick up in the next video with cities and demographics.